Okay, we are now recording. So I'm going to share the screen again. So this is a post-war boom through the presidency of Ronald Reagan, 60s, 70s, 80s. Pretty exciting time period. So as I've done before, I want to do a recap of where we've left off. We saw that Roosevelt and Pinchot have added lands to the national forests and groomed a Forest Service to manage those lands. Forest Service became an agency in 1905. The Park Service, the National Park System, has administrative agency to oversee the growing park and monument system. 1916 is when the Park Service was created. We saw Aldo Leopold and others convince the Forest Service the importance of leaving some lands unmanaged as wilderness. And where we left off is we have an administrative wilderness. And what we'll see today is Congress and the presidency get involved in making it a designated wilderness. And then the 1910 big blow up or the big burn and the two world wars have led to the philosophy and tools to conduct an all out war on wildfire. So leaving World War II, going into post-war era, the war on the Axis becomes the war on fire. And what we see is, the tools of fighting wars, helicopters, jeeps, dozers, things like that. These agencies, the Forest Service, Park Service, BLM, they just start throwing everything at wildfire um, to try to keep it off the landscape. Also in this time period, 1944, we have a fire prevention icon. And originally Smokey's saying was care will prevent 9 out of 10 forest fires. And then they struck that. And then it was, remember, only you can prevent forest fires. And they struck that. And currently it's only you can prevent wildfires. So wildfires being more inclusive of, brush fires, grass fires, more than just forest fires. 1946, the Bureau of Land Management is created. It's in the Department of Interior, created out of a merger of two agencies, the General Land Office and the U.S. Grazing Service. The General Land Office was the one that was, selling or granting land like in homesteads. And the U.S. Grazing Service obviously handled livestock grazing on public lands, on interior lands, not on Forest Service lands. Because at this time, the Forest Service lands are in the Department of Agriculture. And locally, we have what's called the Oregon and California Railroad grant lands that were a checkerboard granted to a railroad entity. And because of some fraudulent actions on the behalf of that railroad entity, the lands were taken back to the federal government. And these Western Oregon lands that are managed by the BLM, they're some of the best timber growing land around. So that's an important piece of the BLM land ownership. We've talked a little bit about Aldo Leopold, but I wanted to mention that his book, and this would be a book I would highly recommend to be on your library shelf, is A Sand County Almanac. So published in 1949, introduces the concept of a land ethic, considered landmark book, and facilitated an interest in ecology from this point onwards. To quote Leopold in terms of a land ethic, a thing is right when it tends to preserve the integrity, stability, and beauty of the biotic community. It is wrong when it tends otherwise. So there's some great quotes in that book, but this is definitely one of them. Also, post-World War II, 1949, we have one of our first tragedies of firefighters being killed by a wildfire. Up until this point in time, a lot of the fatalities were just citizens being killed, like the Peshtigo fire and the Big Burn. There's a good book about this incident, Young Men and Fire by Norman McLean. I think it's in the bibliography. So I would highly recommend that. So, again, the war's over. There's a huge demand for lumber for building houses. So let's see if there's any questions, and then we'll watch a video clip. Okay, well, let's get on with the video, and maybe that'll generate some questions. So I'm going to do the screen share again. And again, this is from The Greatest Good, the history of the Forest Service, that covers conservation quite well.
In the coming years, America would experience a boom like no other.
America needs 3 million homes. With 100,000 marriages every month, heads of new families, veterans mostly, ask, "Where's my house?" More than 700,000 home units were started in 1946, a figure we only reached 7 years after World War I. So cheer up. Maybe these stockpiles will soon be happy homes for all of us.
As we came back from World War II and married and began to raise families, there were tremendous demands on additional housing.
Forest Service research at the Forest Products Lab responded to the housing boom by developing new materials and techniques for using wood efficiently and building affordable homes.
The private forest lands in the country had been pretty well logged to support the war effort during those years.
But with a huge boom in timber production during World War II, much of it war-related, but not all of it, suddenly the private timber industry couldn't fill all the need for wood products from their own lands and began turning to public lands, in particular the national forests.
So the agency was rebuilding, and it was under tremendous pressures to deliver resources that the nation needed in the post-war years.
Meeting these needs was a new generation that entered the Forest Service after the war. Many were veterans who attended forestry colleges on the GI Bill.
I came into the Forest Service after World War II, and this looked like the life for me, to hunt, trap, and fish and live in a cabin in the woods.
The first job that we had took us out to an area that was 9 miles out of town on a highway that was closed in the wintertime. And we lived in a very primitive forest guard station that was without electricity or running water.
He worked from probably 7 o'clock in the morning until dark, and in the summertime, and maybe an hour after it went dark, because he'd be out in the woods and he'd have to get back home.
When you had daylight, you went after the jobs that needed to be done, whether that was a trail building job or cruising some timber or checking for insect and disease problems.
At 6 o'clock a.m., up and fed stock, and Hubert and I cooked breakfast. 7:30 a.m., left camp. Hubert and I lined up some work improving the old trail to the first ford. Scouted ahead into the cliff area near the falls. Some tough trail chance this is. 5:30 p.m., back at camp, found that Art Beach had arrived and had supper ready. 7 o'clock p.m., sharpened my axe and fed the stock. How's that for a nice day in the woods?
We were the generation that had all the baby boom thing. All of us had big families. And on a ranger station, there might be, 3 families and 15 kids.
The Forest Service career was a family business, so to speak, and you and your kids were involved in it.
Everybody that lived on the compound, in the old days, there was 4 or 5 families that lived on the compound. It was really kind of a unique experience. Growing up in the Forest Service, it really was a family. It was a work together, play together, party together, do everything together.
We had to make our own entertainment for our families. So there was a lot of picnicking, and there was all kinds of community things that we did together.
Picnics are horrible things. I gained 12 pounds on one trip in Region 1. They Ladies would come in and heap up the tables with fried chicken and pie and other goodies. They'd all look across to see what I would eat.
Well, the wives were part of the Forest Service organization, really part of the functioning of the Forest Service. They could, unfortunately, they really could run the stations as well as we could.
Sometimes she manned the radio even on lightning fires. We had a radio in our house, Forest Service radio, and she was the communications back at the station when the men were out, you know, on the fire line.
The wife actually ran the ranger district as an unpaid employee. In fact, a couple of times there's evidence of them wanting to remove the ranger, but because they liked the wife so much, they kept the ranger because of the spouse.
When I got my first efficiency rating, it was excellent, except it said that my wife wasn't very sociable. The ranger's wife had teas and my wife didn't go to them. When she saw that, she went down to the ranger's office and demanded that she be paid, or else take her name out of my efficiency report. You know, it was a very paternalistic operation.
The Forest Service was largely a white male organization.
I knew when I went to work there that it was a man's organization. I had no vision that I was going to end up in management. There were no women in the field except for a few that were fire lookouts. But there were no women on the recreation crews, and to think there would be one in a fire crew would have been laughable. No one even imagined that.
The post-war assault on fire was conducted by specialized and well-trained teams. They were known as hotshots.
I think as a hotshot, I walked a little taller. I walked a little straighter because I was part of an elite organization.
When the siren went off, you stopped what you were doing, no matter what it was, and you went to get your tools and get on the truck and away you go.
To me, fire was the enemy, and our job was to put the fire out.
And we'd cut fire line just as quick as you could walk through brush or forest or whatever it was. It was a good job. Talk about family. That hotshot crew was really a family.
Fighting fire looks a lot like war. You see people in uniforms, they have heavy equipment, they are battling something that is a devouring force. But it's really not the kind of war that we're used to in the history books, where casualties are an accepted part of what happens.
We have a whole series of really large, multiple fatality fires. Blackwater, Pepper Run, Man Gulch, Rattlesnake Fire, Inaha, a whole series. Most of the fatalities suffered, except for 1910, came during this one period of time.
By the middle of the 20th century, you had 7 fires that had killed 10 or more firefighters. That's a direct consequence of fighting fires no matter what. And it's quite a list of dead and injured. And to credit the Forest Service, they did catch on to it. They were conscience-struck by what happened, and they called them tragedy fires.
The Forest Service established new safety procedures. Engineering centers developed safety equipment, while scientists studied fire behavior.
We mobilized modern science, going into physics and chemistry and mathematical modeling, better equipment, better knowledge, better organizational methods, sort of specifically trained crews for fires. All this is characteristic of the 50s and early 60s.
As the various equipment came along, the helicopters, the retardant aircraft, and improved tankers, the service became very effective and efficient in addressing fires and suppressing fires.
Another weapon in the war against fire was a public relations campaign.
Smokey the Bear, prowling and a growling and a sniff in the air.
During World War II, the cartoon character Smokey Bear was created to warn against the danger of forest fires. When a bear cub was discovered in a burned-over forest in New Mexico, he became Little Smokey, the living symbol of fire prevention.
Fire before it starts to flame. That's why they call him Smokey. That was how he got his name.
Remember, only you
can prevent forest fires.
And of course, Little Smokey becomes a sensation and becomes a symbol of fire prevention and indeed a symbol of the Forest Service.
Smokey Bear is the second most recognized figure in American culture, only behind Santa Claus.
By the mid-1960s, Smokey was receiving so much mail at his home in the National Zoo, he was given his own zip code.
With the ranger's hat and shovel and a pair of dungarees, you will find him in the forest, always sniffing at the breeze. People stop and pay attention when he tells them to beware, 'cause everybody knows that he's the fire preventing bear. Smokey the Bear, Smokey the Bear.
Howling and a growling and a sniff in the air. He can fight a fire before it starts to flame.
That's why they call him Smokey.
That was how he got his name.
After the election of President Eisenhower in 1952, which marked a conservative shift in the nation's politics, the Forest Service increased its output of forest products.
Okay, we'll stop the video there. Give you an idea of the post-World War II happenings in the Forest Service. I'm going to get back to the slideshow, and then we'll break for questions in a little while. Let's see. Okay, so after World War II, a lot of the private timberland has been cut over to support the war effort, and so there's a demand for timber off of the national forest lands. And so here's, the Forest Service started in 1905. You can see the early period of the Forest Service, very little timber was cut. And, post World War II, you can see just a steady rise of the amount of timber harvested. It really doesn't matter, what the party of the administration was, Republican or Democrat. There was support for cutting timber on national forest lands. And so this is that post World War II boom. And then later, we'll talk about this other end of the graph as things crash with the listing of the northern spotted owl. So in 1960, we have what's called the Multiple Use Sustained Yield Act for the Forest Service. And what it is Congress wants to express that national forests are just more than wood and water. And that was the original Organic Act talked about those two purposes. And so they recognize recreation, range, and wildlife management objectives for the national forest lands. And it also stresses that commodities are to be managed in a sustainable manner. In other words, no impairment to land productivity. So to grow trees or to graze cattle, the land itself is supposed to remain in a productive capacity. And so under multiple use, no single use is supposed to be superior to other uses. We'll see that's not quite true. And we also see multiple use planning to begin to manage management actions. So instead of, a ranger just going out and doing something ahead of time, they do a plan like, what do we want for this chunk of ground? What are the objectives for it? 1962, a very important book. Another one probably you want to have on your bookshelf is Silent Spring by Rachel Carson. She was educated and worked as a marine biologist and developed a skill at very poetic writing. Her book, Silent Spring, expresses the hazards of overuse of pesticides, especially DDT. Not surprisingly, Silent Spring was attacked by the chemical industry. And sadly, Rachel died soon after her book was published, so she never really saw how popular it became. 1963, in the realm of national park management, there's a really important report by Starker Leopold. And Starker is the son of Alda Leopold, teaching at UC Berkeley. And what it was the the national parks saw some problems emerging from their preservation of the national park ecosystems. One of them was, in Yellowstone, the elk were just eating all the aspen trees. And so this report talks about the need to control elk. Also, in some of the Sierra Nevada national parks, they saw that like the giant sequoias weren't reproducing. All we had were old giant sequoias. So they talked about the need for the return of fire to its natural state in the parks. And then a quote from this report is that a national park should be a vignette of primitive America. So kind of looking back, to maybe the 1800s and what essentially what we inherited from indigenous peoples is what we wanted these national parks to look like. So here's a picture of prescribed burning in a national park in a giant sequoia grove. 1964, we get the Wilderness Act. It's Congress's formal designation of wilderness that cannot be undone by an agency. Initially 9 million acres designated. And mostly it's what we call the rock and ice. It's the mountaintops. It's not the lower down productive ecosystems. Bill was written by Howard Zeinhauser of the Wilderness Society. And today there's 109 million acres in the wilderness preservation system. The bill itself was signed by President Johnson, creates a nationwide system of wilderness areas. So you see Park Service wilderness, Forest Service wilderness, BLM wilderness, and some other agencies have their own wilderness. And the bill itself is fairly poetic in the way the language is written. And so a quote from the bill is that it's an area where the earth and its community of life are untrammeled by man, where man himself is a visitor who does not remain. So in terms of the rock and ice wilderness, here's a picture of the Bridger Wilderness in Wyoming, fairly, high country, definitely, snow covered in the wintertime, large granite or other rock type peaks that were glaciated. So to go a little bit further in what is wilderness, it has to be at least 5,000 acres in size. So there's no roads, no mechanized vehicles. And that mechanized vehicle thing, it's seen some issues more recently with the advent of electronic bicycles. Is an electronic bicycle or a bicycle itself, are they considered mechanized? I know it's challenging some of the agencies. No commercial developments, opportunities for unconfined recreation. And typically there's some type of educational, scientific, or historic value to the wilderness itself. So it's not just that, it's the ecosystem being set aside. There may be some historical value to it. So let's stop here, see if there's any questions. Oops.
Is Castle Crags the closest wilderness?
Let's see. No, there's the Red Rocks Wilderness on the California-Oregon border is probably the closest. And then fairly close to it is the Siskiyou Wilderness. And then up in the Cascades, I think there's the BLM might have some wilderness areas near Soda Mountain. And then like in Crater Lake, there's definitely some wilderness. Any other questions or comments?
I was wondering about the, when they were talking about the lives that were lost early on in the Forest Service, are we seeing an uptick at that with the wildfires that we're having now? Or because I mean, I know that we had the thing that happened in Arizona a few years ago.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, even though that video covered the 1950s, yeah, it seems like there's still, every once in a while, a tragedy of firefighters being killed. And unfortunately, something we're seeing in the last, let's say, 5 years is civilians being killed by these, infernos that are wind driven and people can't get out of their houses quick enough. But but there's still, every year a number of firefighter fatalities. So yeah, they haven't quite been able to eliminate that. Okay, well, let's do some more of the slideshow. And then at about 45 minutes in, we'll take a break. So about another 15 minutes of slides, and then we'll take a break. So we just talked about the Wilderness Act, and Wilderness Act is really quite important act for the federal government, Forest Service in particular, because as a pivotal point, it's saying, let's stop developing some specific areas. Let's leave it in its natural state. And it challenges the question of development. Is development inevitable? American exceptionalism, at that time period was that we could do no wrong, and we had just won World War II. There was a vision of every acre of land intensively managed. Wetlands would be drained, converted to developable dry land or farms. Rivers will be dammed and tamed. Farms, converted to suburbs. Even agriculture wasn't seen as the highest and best use. So I bring in personal experience regarding my grandparents on my mother's side. They were raised and educated in Wisconsin, and uniquely, they were both college grads. Came to California in the early 1900s and raised oranges in a family at the foot of the San Gabriel Mountains in Glendora, California. And I think they had about 20 acres of oranges, Felenches and Navels, and their pension was to sell their orange groves to housing developers. So what I barely remember as a kid, these orange groves, it's all houses now. Okay, so continuing on our timeline, we're in the mid 1960s. There's an important law passed in 65, the Land and Water Conservation Fund. And it sets up a fund primarily from offshore oil and gas royalties used by states and the federal government to acquire conservation lands, water, easements. And unfortunately, it has to have an annual appropriation from Congress, and Congress rarely fully funded the bill. It expired in September of 2018, and people thought, oh, that's it for the Land and Water Conservation Fund. But there was a bipartisan bill passed in 2019 that continued this fund, I think now in perpetuity. And more recently, Congress has given it more funding. So that's definitely a good thing in the realm of conservation. I have a diagram here to kind of show how the Land and Water Conservation Fund works. It's not only offshore oil and gas receipts. There's some minor amounts of money from recreation fees. So you might go to a campground and see, this is a fee area. Well, a portion of that can go to this fund, fuels tax and property sales. And so it creates this pot of money. And then it goes out to mostly land acquisition, but some grants to states, and then some other things. So it's an important way of funding conservation work. So now, we're in the late 60s. We've seen earlier in the 60s, the Wilderness Bill passed. 1968, we get the Wild and Scenic Rivers Act. Recommendation of a presidential commission sponsored by Frank Church of Idaho. And so initially 8 rivers were designated, and now there's over 203 rivers in the system. Rivers they must possess some type of outstandingly remarkable feature to become a wild and scenic river, scenic, recreation, geologic, fish, whatever. But the important part of the Wild and Scenic Rivers Act is that the river must be maintained in a free flowing condition. And there's 3 classifications: wild, scenic, and recreation, which allows certain levels of development. You know, let's say like a road might parallel a recreational river, while a wild river will be like a wilderness where maybe you only access it by a raft or a kayak or hiking a hiking trail. But because it must be maintained in a free-flowing condition, this put off limits to dam building quite a few rivers in the United States. So for damming our rivers, this was definitely the beginning of the end for a lot of those big projects. Same year, we get the National Trail System Act. So you can see these nationwide systems are beginning to be created. You know, we have a system of wilderness areas, a system of wild and scenic rivers, and now we have a system of national trails. And that's to promote the preservation of and public access to travel within and enjoyment of and appreciation of open air, outdoor areas, and historic resources of the nation. And again, kind of like rivers, these trails can be scenic, recreation, and historic, so different designations. You know, more locally, we have the Pacific Crest Trail. It's a national scenic trail. So we're getting to late 1960s, pushing into the early 1970s. We see a growing anti-war movement, a growing distrust of industry and government. You know, what's kind of interesting, it wasn't so much left versus right, but it was kind of the counterculture versus the establishment. We have an anti-technology sentiment, a back to the land. You know, a lot of people I know in my generation, you know, headed to the woods, you know, built a cabin, lived in a teepee, did something like that to kind of reclaim that lifestyle. And so this time period, we see the beginning of environmental activism. So we have an environmentalism coming on the scene. You know, we had and it's in some ways it's a reaction to that post-World War II boom. You know, we had a big demand for stuff. We had this big increase in population, baby boomers. You know, we had Better Life Through Chemistry that Rachel Carson's book, you know, really pushed back against. There was, you know, fear of, you know, harnessing the atom. You know, we had atomic bombs, hydrogen bombs. We had the growth of suburbia, campus unrest, and even had rivers catching on fire. There was a river in, I think it was the Cuyahoga River, actually had so much oil on top of it, it caught on fire. So actually, I'm going to take a break for any comments or questions before we look at this video clip. So I'll stop the share. Cassie.
Yes, John, on the budget allotment, I think I remember it said 3% or 3 cents for camping fees. Is that true with, like, if you go to a state park or if you're just camping in general? Is it usually only 3% of that is, or 3 cents of the dollar is going towards the fund?
Actually, that was, I think it was in millions of dollars. It was 0.3 million going to the Land and Water Conservation Fund from recreation. So yeah, it wasn't about the individual fee itself. It was about the total aggregation of all those recreation fees going into that fund. But
that's not very much.
No, I mean, it just shows that offshore oil and gas royalties are huge to the federal government in supporting that fund. Anybody else?
I've got my hand up.
Oh, yes, Barbara.
I was wondering, in the wild and scenic rivers, does it have to be the entire river, which seems amazing, or is it a minimal segment or a maximal segment?
Yeah, it's a good question. Like we saw with wilderness, there was a 5,000 acre minimum to become a wilderness area. For wild and scenic rivers, there's no minimum length I know of. And yeah, so they can pick out a certain segment of a river and make it wild and scenic and be above it and below it, it could be totally developed. So an example I'd use is the Snake River on the Idaho-Oregon border. You have a Hell's Canyon Dam, and below that, the Snake River is wild and scenic. So a lot of, so a wild and scenic river, may be controlled, by the water coming out of a dam. Oh,
John, I think you have the same situation on the Rogue River.
Right.
The lower Rogue is the wild and scenic stretch, but not all the way to the coast and not all the way above it.
Right. Yeah. So it's kind of sandwiched by undesignated stretches with the wild stretch in the middle.
Also, on the Columbia, I know that when I was on the Hanford group, that there's that one segment around what I call the bump out of the Columbia as it goes by Hanford.
Mm-hmm.
That's the only free and flowing, but I don't know if it's a wild and scenic, but it is certainly historical.
Yeah. It's the
There
fact
was
that
9 reactors there.
Yeah, the fact that it's free flowing, because a lot of the Columbia, it's just one dam after another.
Right.
Okay, any other comments or questions? Actually, I'm going to take our 5-minute break right now because I got to get the next video clip queued up. So I have 11:40, so we'll come back at 11:45. Thanks. Okay, what we'll see here in a minute is that the Nixon administration actually did quite a bit to further conservation. Definitely a different time period of politics as compared to today. First, I want to mention the book, The Population Bomb, 1968. I remember reading it when I was in high school. He was a professor at Stanford, and it warned of mass starvation due to overpopulation. And while some of the things that he warned about never came to happen, it definitely was a wake-up call for the pressures of population on the earth. 1969, we have David Brower as the executive director of the Sierra Club. He had fought dams in Dinosaur and Grand Canyon national monuments. And then he started a series of glossy coffee table books to really push the Sierra Club message. And so what we see is the membership in the Sierra Club swells from 7,000 when he started to 70,000. So he was quite effective in making the Sierra Club a mainstream environmental organization. Here's a cover of one of those coffee table books about the Grand Canyon that Brower was pushing. Brower's work caught the attention of the federal government, and the IRS takes away the nonprofit status of the Sierra Club. So today you have the club itself, and then there's a Sierra Club Foundation that is its nonprofit branch. These fancy books were losing money, even though they were getting the word out about some fairly spectacular areas. It wasn't a moneymaker for the Sierra Club, and so Brower leaves the Sierra Club in 1969. He goes on to found the Friends of the Earth and the Earth Island Institute. 1970, our first Earth Day, and I know that tradition has continued. We saw nationwide demonstrations in support of environmental protections. It was a bipartisan thing of, we had a Wisconsin Senator, Gaylord Nelson, and Pete McCloskey, a Republican from California, were the chair and co-chair of the Earth Day, first Earth Day. 20 million people participated, and now it's a worldwide event. So I'm going to stop the slideshow here for a second, and we're going to watch a short film clip about the Earth Day. If I can find the film clip.
The genius of Earth Day is really a story of an event that is famous and yet remarkably little known. So everyone has heard of Earth Day. We still celebrate it, but the first Earth Day in 1970 had never been the subject of a book before. And although people recognized that it was important, they really thought it was important largely as a symbol. Millions and millions of people turn out on that day to show in all kinds of ways that they care about the environment, and that helps to launch an environmental decade of legislation and reform. But I found that the story was a lot more complicated than that. Earth Day isn't the beginnings of environmental activism by any means. There's already a long history, almost a century long, by Earth Day, of people grappling in one way or another with all the unintended consequences of our rapid growth, industrialization, urbanization, growth in numbers as a nation. What's new is a new urgency on the one hand. After World War II, we have many, many new technologies that create all kinds of new, in many cases, far larger in scale hazards than the old forms of pollution that may even ultimately threaten the very survival of humankind. And there's also, because of the post-war economic boom, a new willingness of newly affluent Americans to demand higher quality of life. They have some of the basic necessities. They're not just worried about the absolute minimum of food and shelter and clothing. Now they can really say, I want things to be nice. I really want to be able to enjoy what I have. And the combination of graver hazards, more far-reaching hazards, and a new willingness to say enough, we don't have to put up with this anymore, is the backstory that leads to Earth Day. Unlike some of the other major protests that came out of the other movements of the 60s, Earth Day really didn't have any predecessor. There were no earlier, smaller versions of Earth Day. Barry Commoner, a scientist who 2 months before Earth Day was on the cover of Time magazine when they had a special issue on the environment, he speaks at a teach-in at the University of Michigan, environmental teach-in, in the basketball arena. There's 15,000 people there. No environmentalist had ever spoken to a crowd that big before. And for all these people, I think, individually, this forced them to think harder about how much they cared about these issues, what they were willing to do. They're articulating for the first time what they really think, or they're speaking to a more diverse audience, and they're stretched. Some became more personal and intimate. Some became more prophetic. But this really was an unprecedented national debate about environmental issues, that thousands and thousands and thousands of people suddenly participating, talking about things that very few people had talked about or even written about before. And the other thing that was astonishing to me about Earth Day, because there were so few experts, young people in particular could leap many, many rungs of what would normally be the occupational hierarchy and become experts. 20-somethings are speaking on Earth Day and then publishing books about what you can do to save the environment that are brought out in mass market paperback that sell 100,000 or more copies. All kinds of people come out of Earth Day with a very entrepreneurial sense that there's no obvious career paths for people interested in these issues. They're going to make careers. They're going to make niches because they're now committed. They weren't before. Many of them weren't even interested in environmental issues, but they become avid about it and dedicated. We don't trust our students as much as many of the people of the Earth Day generation did. That young people were absolutely critical, both to Earth Day itself and to the legacies of Earth Day. And a lot of that was because older people didn't stand in their way, and in many cases actively encouraged them. So many university presidents and high school principals and others really saying to young people, we trust you to use the skills and the knowledge that you have to really do something good, and they did.
All right. So that's the Earth Day video clip. a personal experience I would share that I was in high school in 1970, and we used to drive to high school because it was up on top of a hill, mile or two away. And that day we all walked to high school. And then at lunchtime, for someone had brought in an old car into the quad for the high school. And my high school was about 2,000 people, pretty big high school. And for 10 cents, you got a sledgehammer and you got to whack the car. And so definitely, the automobile was definitely seen as kind of a symbol of what wasn't quite right with America, at least at my high school. So let me show a few more slides and then we'll take a break for questions and comments. Okay, so we just covered Earth Day along with the Wilderness Act, definitely an important thing in the history of conservation. So, Richard Nixon, an unlikely environmentalist, what was the motivation? Was it the Santa Barbara oil spill of the late 60s, killing seabirds, dolphins, seals, and lions? Was it the burning of Cleveland's Cuyahoga River catching fire, or was it simply politics? This next slide shows his accomplishments, which are quite significant. He created the EPA. He signed the National Environmental Policy Act that we're going to cover here in a minute, created the Council on Environmental Quality, signed the Endangered Species Act, signed the Clean Water Act, banned the use of DDT. Rachel Carson talked about how bad DDT was for birds. In terms of the automobile, required catalytic converters. Up until that time, there was lead in our gasoline, and we were switching over to unleaded. Created the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, which, besides doing weather, they manage ocean fisheries, including anadromous fish, salmon, and steelhead. Signed the Clean Air Act, and again, relating to automobiles, for a short time period, there was a 55-mile-per-hour speed limit to conserve gasoline. But I do want to talk about more about the National Environmental Policy Act, otherwise known as NEPA. Requires federal agencies to look before they leap regarding federal actions. So it doesn't actually require the federal government to mitigate the negative impacts of a federal action. So, maybe the clear cut still goes ahead or the dam still gets built, but the agency that's promoting that action has to at least go through an analysis process and disclose the effects of that action, and then prepare and circulate some kind of statement. Environmental impact statement is the Cadillac of NEPA. And a lot of agencies, such as the Forest Service, have documents for minor actions, such as an environmental assessment, that they would circulate instead. Want to get into some early NEPA case law. I don't know if you ever heard of Mineral King in the southern Sierra Nevadas, a beautiful valley that was going to become a ski area. At this time, it was part of the National Forest System. And so what I have here is propose a ski area and get a national park. This fairly poor photo here in the lower left-hand corner, that's me, my family, and cousins camping in Mineral King. Through most of the 60s, when we did an annual camping trip, we would go up to Mineral King and we would just plop down our tents right along the creek, stay there for a week or two, and have a grand old time. So let's look at a little video clip and then we'll break for any questions or comments. So do the screen share again. Okay, got to get to the right. Here we go.
In late 1965, Walt Disney himself handed plans over to the government for what he believed would be the next major expansion for Walt Disney Productions, a ski resort just north of Porterville, California. Let's dig into the history behind Disney's Mineral King Ski Resort and why it was never built. Walt always had a love of winter sports, even investing in a ski resort founded by his friend Hans Schroll in 1939. This partnership and his love of winter sports would extend throughout the rest of his life. In 1959, Walt Disney Productions released a film titled Third Man on the Mountain, which was shot in Switzerland and even featured Hans Schroll. During the production of this film, Walt fell in love with the Swiss Alps, a love that would shape the future of the company in many ways. Around the time of the release of the film, Walt Disney was asked to produce the opening and closing ceremonies of the 1960 Winter Olympics in Squaw Valley, California. Shortly afterward, Walt started to execute his idea of building a Disney-branded ski resort and started surveying potential sites in California and Colorado. He ended up falling in love with Mineral King Valley, just north of Porterville, California in Sequoia National Park. He later said, "When I first saw Mineral King 5 years ago, I thought it was one of the most beautiful spots I had ever seen, and we want to keep it that way." This attitude was the foundation for the valley's development, to keep its natural beauty intact while creating a world-class resort destination. Walt personally submitted his proposal to the U.S. Forest Service in late 1965. It called for an isolated alpine-like town with no automobiles. Visitors would park in a huge futuristic parking garage that would be constructed to fit with the terrain, hiding it from view. Once they parked, visitors would take a transportation system from the garage to the town, completely isolating them from the outside world. The town would have been host to an ice skating rink, several shops, a golf course, 2 large hotels, 10 restaurants, and 14 ski lifts. The service areas for the resort would be kept underground, and the entire village would be invisible from the entrance to the valley. The town would have also played host to what is now a classic Disney attraction, Country Bear Jamboree. The entire resort was originally planned to handle 8,500 visitors daily and would have cost $35 million, more than 11 times the budget that the Forest Service had originally requested. Out of 6 submitted, the Forest Service approved Disney's proposal and awarded them a 3-year permit to develop a master plan. The approval of that master plan would mean a 30-year lease of the land from the Forest Service, but that approval was contingent on the creation of a 25-mile all-weather highway to the valley. Almost exactly a year after turning in his proposal, Walt Disney died on December 15, 1966. This made Mineral King one of the last major Disney projects that Walt was personally involved with, but the project was soon taken over by the Imagineers. The Imagineers submitted their master plan for the resort a few years later, and it was approved in January of 1969. This new plan changed some of Walt's original ideas, but the overall direction remained the same. Mineral King was set to open in winter of 1973, just after the highway's planned completion. Environmental activists led by the Sierra Club became vocally opposed to the project. They argued that the all-weather access road would displace too much soil, and the construction of the highway through Sequoia National Park was illegal. This prevented any construction until the case eventually reached the Supreme Court, who ruled in favor of Disney in 1972. Even though this victory seemingly made it clear for Disney to start construction, they still had to deal with the National Environmental Policy Act. This bill required the Forest Service to prepare a detailed statement on the environmental impact of any proposed actions, including the construction of Disney's highway. Eventually, Disney announced a revision to their master plan, which scaled down the project in 1972 in order to make the plans more financially viable. The new plan for Mineral King was to cost just $15 million and contain a fraction of the original facilities. It also proposed the construction of a cog railway in place of more than half of the original planned highway. Even with the release of this new plan, Disney could not start construction, as the Forest Service was busy preparing their draft of the environmental impact of the shortened highway and cog railway. They finally released the almost 600-page draft in 1976. This was almost 4 years since Disney had released their revised construction plans, and unfortunately, it seemed that they had simply lost interest in the project, as well as being clouded by all of the controversy surrounding their legal battles with the Sierra Club and other environmental conservationists. The final nail in the coffin was the National Parks and Recreation Act of 1978. This bill designated Mineral King as part of Sequoia National Park, preventing any future development of the valley. So, what do you think? Would you have liked to see a Disney ski resort? Let us know.
So for me, I guess that's a personal thing of having camped there and then finding out that a ski area was supposed to go in, and then working for the Forest Service later on and finding that that was one of the first big projects that had to go through the National Environmental Policy Act process and was challenged and never happened. Now, one thing that's kind of interesting is that the Disney Corporation went on to look at additional areas in California up near Lake Tahoe and north of Lake Tahoe for a ski area. And they never found a spot where they could put in a Disney ski area. So they abandoned that. So let's take any comments or questions about where we're at so far in the history of conservation. Tamsin, I see your hand is up.
Yeah, two things. One is Dennis Hayes, whom you showed a picture of, now works for the Bullitt Foundation in Seattle. And he has been responsible for building the greenest commercial building in the world. Huh. And if you ever get a chance to take a tour of it, do, because it's fascinating, all the different things. And they also, one of their criteria was sourcing everything relatively locally. They've just done so much with that building, and it's right in the middle of downtown Seattle. The other thing about environmental impact statements, you're right, they are critical. I read chunks of the one for Jordan Cove here, and some of it was ridiculous. Like they were going to build a little wall on the ocean for tsunami. I mean, but it was a powerful tool for those of us that were fighting against Jordan Cove.
Right. Just by forcing an agency to disclose what they're proposing, what they're thinking of, sometimes, yeah, can lead to an action that either modifies or even cancels that project. Any other comments or questions? Okay, well, we will go back to the slides and then wrap up today by 12:30. Okay, so we just talked about Mineral King, my childhood camping spot. 1972, the Clean Water Act. Again, it's one of those acts that Nixon signed off on. It regulates point source and non-point source pollution. One way of looking at that, if it comes out of a pipe, it's a point source pollution. If it's like on the landscape, it's a non-point source pollution. And that non-point source, that's really important for forestry. And so to address sediment in creeks, erosion, things like that, forestry was now managed under what they call best management practices. And then an interesting part of the Clean Water Act is much of the regulatory authority was transferred to the states. And so the states typically oversee water quality management instead of the EPA, although the EPA still kind of provides overall guidance. 1973, the Endangered Species Act. And one thing I need to point out is that typically your animals, plants, and fish are under the jurisdiction of the state. It's one of those, our founding fathers gave a lot of power to the states. And, wildlife was one of those things that states typically manage. So you have your state wildlife agencies, fish and game, things like that. But in 73, we see the federal government step in and saying, if one of these species is at risk of becoming extinct, that it can get federal protection and be classified as either threatened or endangered. And that by being listed, that provides additional protections for the individual species and their habitats. And for a lot of these species, it's the habitat that's critical. And so federal projects are since this act, have to be evaluated and document the impacts to listed species, and then consult with the Fish and Wildlife Service and NOAA Fisheries, an agency that Nixon created. Just briefly, in 1974, we have this Forest and Rangeland Renewable Resources Planning Act, and it just required a periodic assessment of our national forest resources, looking at demand, looking at what's on the land. 1976, we have what's considered the Bureau of Land Management's Organic Act. And so this 1976 Act really gives marching directions to the Bureau of Land Management. Like the Forest Service, they're given a multiple use mandate, and public lands that are being managed by the BLM are now to remain in federal ownership. And so the disposal of these federal lands, this is really the end of the disposal. You know, we saw a lot of it in the 1800s with all the grants to railroads and the Homestead Acts, but you know, this is the federal government saying we want to keep these remaining federal lands, and so any of the remaining homesteading laws were repealed. One thing I want to point out, again, it's kind of a personal experience of mine, is in the 1970s, you had a college professor at UC Berkeley named Harold Biswell, who was a pioneer in fire ecology. And what's interesting is at that time, the other forestry professors were pretty much against the concept of purposefully burning the forest. You know, they saw it as, you know, too damaging to the timber. You know, we really were in the early stages of realizing the importance of fire to our forested ecosystems, especially in the West. And so Biswell taught a series of courses, extension courses on, you know, at Yosemite, Calaveras State Park, in Chaparral in Southern California, and Mount Diablo, talking about the ecology of fire on the landscape. So we can take a short break here, see if there's any questions or comments.
Well, I will say really quickly, there was a movie at the Independent Film Festival called Anchor, about women firefighters, and that Greater Good video. Thank you for sending all those out. That was really cool. Talked about how that happened. The film is great.
Yeah, in the 1970s, we do see, you know, women joining the ranks of firefighters. You know, in the mid 70s, I spent a season working at Yosemite National Park. And what was interesting, they were hiring their first all-female fire crew. And for some reason, they didn't feel like it could be a co-ed crew. So it was all female, and they put them at a fairly remote location. It's kind of the thinking at the time. Any other comments? Bob?
Yeah, I'm just thinking about how thank God for the Endangered Species Act, but what an awkward tool it is insofar as it's not holistic, it's individualistic, right? In the sense that we're going to save one species, and then we can extend that and say, well, the species requires the whole ecosystem to survive, and so that's a sort of environmental pushing of a law that's made sort of on the individualistic model that our culture likes. And I remember when there were debates about our local monument, someone saying, what's more important, people or owls? And I think it sets that up. Again, I'm glad we got it, but it's an awkward tool because it sets up that sort of individualistic notion. And what I wanted to say, what I did say was that would be like being in a coal mine and saying what's more important, people or canaries, as the canaries are dying. So it's a fight to take a law that was made on a sort of individualistic, if you want to call it that, model, and do the education to have that become an environmental or ecological protection.
Yeah, what we'll see, those are great points, Bob. What we'll see next week when we get into the northern spotted owl, the Northwest Forest Plan, is that people recognize the failings of the Endangered Species Act. To just focus on one species that's about to go extinct, you kind of miss that all these things that led up to those problems. And so what we'll see in the 90s and beyond is this concept of ecosystem management. So trying to manage the whole ecosystem for species and habitat, and not just focus on those critters that are about to go extinct. Anybody else? Okay, I got a few more slides and we should be done by 12:30. In this slide here showing a fire in the forest. Hopefully you saw that my title here is Good Fire. So this is the type of thing that typically Native Americans might have lit. Typically lightning fires, back before we started putting out fires, that they would, go through the forest and maybe kill these small trees and brush. The larger trees would survive. And so the fire, after the fire, we still had a forest. It wasn't a stand replacing fire where everything gets killed. Now there's a clear cut for you. So in the late 70s, the Forest Service runs into some issues. And kind of we saw a little bit of in the video. What is the greatest good of these national forests? Clear cutting became more common, extensive road building, using chemicals to control brush. Maybe a mixed conifer stand is clear cut and then planted with one species, where it used to be a mixture. I know I experienced this, that a lot of the fellow classmates of mine in forestry school, they wanted to practice high yield forestry, which is, very intensive. You're using chemicals, maybe you're using fertilizers, you're probably planting some type of genetically enhanced species to try to, get the most wood as quickly on a piece of ground. And so there's two controversies on two national forests. On the Monongahela forest, you have clear-cutting turkey habitat, and the turkey hunters aren't very happy. And then on the Bitterroot National Forest, you have where they're terracing, basically cutting into the hillside after clear cutting for the replanting. And then one thing was pointed out by the environmental groups is that the Forest Service Organic Act of 1897 limits harvesting to dead, mature, or large trees. And the Forest Service was not following that law. So in 1976, we get the National Forest Management Act, which legalizes even age management on national forests. But then there's some requirements. Requires fairly prompt reforestation, requires that every national forest acre be covered by a land management plan, requires that public involvement be provided in coming up with actions on national forests. And Hubert Humphrey was a co-sponsor of the National Forest Management Act. And I kind of get a kick out of his quote here. He wanted to get forest management out of the courts and back into the woods. That was a good goal, Hubert, but it didn't quite happen. I think after this, we saw even more litigation on national forest actions. And just a quick slide here. We talk about even age management, and here the trees are all the same age. And in an uneven age, you have a variety of sizes and ages of trees. And this is the National Forest Management Act actually makes the even age legal, although in some places we still practice uneven age management. Late 1970s, we have something called Rare 2, which is the roadless area something evaluation. I can't remember what the second R is, but it's an inventory of roadless areas. There was a Rare 1 in the early 70s, but it was withdrawn by the Forest Service. And it's an attempt to determine what areas should be added to the National Wilderness Preservation System. Because on our national forests, we still have these huge areas that are roadless, that haven't been, trees haven't been harvested, that are, in other words, they're de facto wilderness. And there's a desire to determine, should it go wilderness or should it be subject to multiple use management? And so 62 million acres were inventoried and evaluated. And the Forest Service recommends 15 million acres for wilderness out of the 62 million. So fairly quickly, the state of California sues the Forest Service, and the courts found the NEPA inadequate for a Rare 2. Same time in the late 70s, Jimmy Carter is president. And this is a photo of Alaska. And we have a really important bill, the Alaska National Interest Lands Conservation Act. And I'm not going to go through all the things here, but it provides a lot of protected federal lands in Alaska. And it also really helps the indigenous peoples in Alaska get a better handle on managing their lands. But it's a very significant piece of legislation that Jimmy Carter pushed through right before he left the presidency. And as we know, Jimmy was not reelected. So in 1980, Ronald Reagan is elected as president. And he appoints James Watt as his Secretary of Interior. Watt is aggressively anti-environmentalist. And so the memberships in environmental groups such as the Sierra Club, Wilderness Society, Audubon Society, their membership soar because people are pretty unhappy with what is happening. At the same time, during the Reagan administration, we have something called the Sagebrush Rebellion, where there's a perceived loss of privileges, especially in rural Western states, of privileges to mine, to graze, livestock, to harvest timber, due to the rise of these environmental laws. And I think there's a direct link of this 1980s Sagebrush Rebellion, an anti-government, anti-federal law, to the January 6th takeover of the Capitol. At least in my mind, I see a connection. Interestingly, during the Reagan administration in 1984, we had that rare two of looking at potential wilderness areas fail. But as an election year, there was a state-by-state attempt to do legislation to take these inventoried roadless areas and make them wilderness. And so what we see is that there's 20 bills totaling over 8 million acres that are put into the wilderness preservation system, except for in Idaho and Montana, where there was still too much controversy and not enough support from their legislators to get something passed. And these bills included what was called release language. And you had soft release, where the area could be considered for wilderness again, or hard release, where supposedly wilderness consideration would be delayed, although no one really paid attention to that release language. And so here's a cartoon of Watt, and the end to today's slideshow. So before we hit 12:30, any other comments or questions? And next week, we'll get into the listing of the northern spotted owl. We'll also take a little bit look at the late 1980s wildfires in Yellowstone and how that kind of sets up some of today's wildfire management.
Yeah, John, actually, this is Tamsin again. I do have a question about David Brower. You presented the change, going to Friends of the Earth, starting Friends of the Earth as an economic issue because of the lack of sale. We always thought of him as he got tired of the conservatism of the Sierra Club, and he was revered as a more honest, radical environmentalist, i.e. Friends of the Earth. So that might have been the Forest Service idea of why he left the Sierra Club and started Friends of the Earth, but it was very different on the environmental side.
Well, I think he and the Sierra Club agreed to part ways, that the Sierra Club wasn't quite happy with him. And so they were okay with him going on to form these other groups.
Right.
Okay, well, I will see you all in a week. Tomorrow, I'll send out a copy of the slides, and I will post the recording, the video.